So much of human life seems to depend on our viewing one another as conscious agents capable of free choice.
Neuroscience shows that we don't have free will. I think their reasons for saying that are ill-considered, and moreover that what they're doing is apt to be mischievous and doing some real harm.
The deepest questions, the darkest intuitions. This is The Moral Trigger.
All throughout the day, every day, we have little conversations with ourselves inside of our heads. And these conversations really do last all day long from the time you wake up until you fall asleep. But even when you fall asleep, your brain is still constantly going, which we now know is the reason for our dreams. Now I want you to think about the fact that all of those thoughts that just happen throughout the day really do seem to pop in and out of nowhere. I mean, just think about how many times you have been sitting there and something really just pops into your head. And there's a lot of times we really don't know why those thoughts pop into our head. And sometimes it just seems mysterious. But there's a lot of things going on in our brains that seem mysterious. Just think about the fact that you really don't have control over understanding the words that are coming out of my mouth right now. Your brain just seems to do it. And so to really explain this, I want you to think about 3 movies. These could be any movies at all. Some of you may have thought about Spider-Man. Some of you may have thought about The Bourne Identity. Or some of you may have even thought about Twilight. Hey, I can't even account for those 3 movies that just happened to pop into my head right now at this specific moment. It truly seemed like those popped in and out of nowhere. And years ago, there was a study done, and this neuroscientist had an electron probe, and what they were able to do was touch certain parts of the brain, and they were able to trigger specific songs, feelings, and memories. And it was really cool because at one point, the guy was able to play a specific Guns N' Roses song just by probing a specific connection in the brain. So what that tells us is that the brain really does have everything to do with our thoughts. Now, during those studies, they really didn't have free will to think about those thoughts because someone was messing with their brain. However, outside influences are a lot like the surgeon in that they do have a huge effect on what goes on with our brain. We can also think about the fact that we don't pick which neurotransmitters fire, we don't pick what way they fire. And it's a lot like how we don't pick how our kidney filters blood, it just happens. So back in the 1980s, there was this really famous study done by Benjamin LeBay, and his intention was to shed some scientific light on the philosophical debate of free will. So what the study had shown was that there's a small delay between when our brains make a decision and then when we're consciously aware of it. Now, it has been hotly debated since whether this actually shows if we have free will or if we don't. And there have been many follow-up studies trying to replicate his findings, and those are also hotly debated in both the scientific and in the philosophical community. So in the debate on free will, there are 3 sides. One is called determinism. And this says that the doctrine holds that all events, including human action, are ultimately determined by causes external to the will. Some philosophers have taken determinism to imply that individual human beings have no free will and cannot be held morally responsible for their actions. So on the complete opposite side of determinists, you have the libertarians, and this doesn't have anything to do with the political theory. And libertarian free will means that our choices are free from the determination or constraints of human nature and free from any predetermination by God. It's also worth mentioning that very few modern philosophers hold this view. Now you also have the compatibilists like Daniel Dennett, and what they try to do is bridge the gap between the libertarians and the determinists. They believe in determinism, but that free will is still compatible with physical determinism. So I wanted to give you this quote from neuroscientist and philosopher Sam Harris. And in this episode, I will be referencing him and his ideas a lot, and I highly recommend you get his book called Free Will. He said that, quote, "We do not know what we intend to do until that intention itself arises. Consider what it would take to have free will. You would need to be aware of all the factors that determine your thoughts and actions, and you would need to have complete control over these factors. But there is a paradox here that vitiates the very notion of freedom. For what would influence the influences? More influences? So we really don't get to author our traits. Well, at least initially, right? Because we don't get to pick our genes, we don't get to pick the environment that we're born into, and you have to think about how important that kind of stuff really is, especially in the beginning when kids are in preschool. The development and the relationships and everything that happens within the beginning years really does affect who people become later on in life. So I had asked you guys, if you don't pick your parents, your genes, and all that kind of stuff, in what sense do you think you're really free? And also think about how young kids do get brainwashed by groups like ISIS and North Korea. Are they really free to make their own decisions?
I would definitely say that your genes and your environment and how you were raised and everything like that has a massive influence on your decisions and your beliefs. And I think the vast majority of people are more than likely going to assimilate to whatever it is that is around them, especially in their environment, and start developing pretty strong cognitive biases against anything that's opposite of that. However, I do not think that people are doomed to only be assimilated to the beliefs that are around them. And I kind of reached this decision just from history. Basically, if everybody in the world only did what was around them, then there wouldn't really have been a whole lot of change, and there wouldn't have been these great historical figures who brought change to their communities. And you can think of people like children who were raised in Nazi Germany who don't have anti-Semitic beliefs, or people in early America who decided that slavery was wrong, even though both of those things were very much so the norms and what they grew up in and what was around them. They still made the decision that that was wrong, and then oftentimes decided to act against it.
Well, I think once you hit a certain point in your life, you learn how to decipher between what you've learned was right and what you feel is right. So I think to a certain extent, there's a part of you that will always believe that what your parents taught you, what the environment taught you is right. But then there's also like a part of you that's individually you. So you can also decide, you can go against it. Because what else would decide whether we defy our parents? It's like you have an instinct, your own soul like tells you what you feel is right. So sometimes that goes against what you believe. But also, your parents, some people tend to believe everything that they've been told because they have no reason to disbelieve it. So I think it's hard to decide whether or not you're going to stick to what your parents say or whether you're going to defy them. But I think that your parents have a lot to do with your environment has a lot to do with telling you what they say is correct, and it's whether you decide to follow that and go on or go against them. So think about how kids are brainwashed in places like ISIS, controlled areas, and North Korea. Are they really free to make their own decisions? I think they're free to know what's right in their mind, but whether they act on it is not always the case because they're in areas where they know that if they don't follow, they're going to die. So I think that it kind of takes away their own free will because they get to the point where it's hard to decipher through what is correct and what is not. So they're forced to just go with it, and it's sad.
So what happens when your brain really isn't wired like everyone else's? So according to Thomas Insel, who is the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, 1 out of 5 people suffer from mental illnesses like depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, PTSD, anxiety attacks, but 1 out of 20 of them do become actually disabled. So that means if you take any group of 5 people, one of them is struggling in some way that we may not be exactly aware of. And the University of Washington Mental Health and Suicide page said that the great majority of people who experience a mental illness do not die by suicide. However, of those who die by suicide, more than 90% of them have a diagnosable mental disorder. And also the National Alliance on Mental Illness said that suicide is the 10th leading cause of death among adults in the US and the 2nd leading cause of death among people aged 10 to 24, and these rates are increasing. So this gets me thinking about how important something like mental illness really is. Connor Wood, so he studies philosophy at Boston University. He has this really interesting blog in where he was discussing the link between mental illness and free will. So he talks about an evolutionary reason for certain behaviors like depression. And it seems that depression is quite common. Many of you maybe know someone who's depressed or even struggling with it yourself. So he says that in a physical sense, depression is just serotonin out of whack. But depression also gives you a chance to take a breather when social circumstances go crazy. And he says that, quote, temporary depression makes you withdraw from the frantic arena of social competition and protect yourself from further defeat. So we assess the situation, we heal our wounds, and we recover our strength. And obviously some people are better at doing that than others. So earlier we were talking about how the brain really is connected to all of our thoughts. So what's going on inside of the brain of people who aren't necessarily, quote, normal? So the normal brain is kind of like calm weather. There are billions of molecules in the air that determine what weather will happen. And when a certain pattern of those molecules become disturbed, it causes abnormal weather. And this is a lot like the brain in that neurons are like the molecules, because when certain parts of the brain become inept, so like part of the brain that understands emotions, fear, and future planning, that overall person just becomes, quote, abnormal. Sam Harris in that book said, quote, "You do not control the storm. You are not lost in the storm. You are the storm." But which part is you? And this takes us to the really interesting problem of identity. So I wanted to start with the shipathesis, and it's also been called the boat paradox. So Plutarch, who is an ancient Greek historian, he had wrote years ago that, quote, "The ship wherein Theseus and the young Athens returned had 30 oars, and was preserved by the Athenians down even to the time of Demetrius Phalereus. For they took away the old planks as they decayed, putting in new and stronger timber in their place, insomuch that this ship became a standing example among the philosophers. For the logical question of things that grow, one side holding that the ship remained the same, and the other contending that it was not the same." So what he's saying is that if you have a ship and you slowly replace the parts on the ship, so say you start with the steering wheel, and then you take all of those replacement parts and you put it in a shed, and then you slowly replace the parts so that the boat eventually becomes replaced completely and you have all of the old scrap parts inside of the shed. So then you decide, wow, I have enough to make another boat. So you take all of the old scraps and you make a new boat. So the question is, which one is your actual boat? Is it the one that you had slowly replaced? And if it was, at what point did that become the new boat? Or is the one that you had created out of the original parts, is that your, quote, new boat? And Plutarch had meant this as a metaphor for the body, because our bodies are constantly changing and our thoughts are constantly changing, and we really aren't sure what exactly is, quote, us. And so there's this really cool TED video about identity, and they say, quote, "Which you is who? The person you are today, 5 years ago, who you'll be in 50 years, and when is am? This week, today, this hour, this second? And which aspect of you is I? Are you your physical body, your thoughts and feelings, your actions?" And so I wanted to tie this into our mental illness discussion because there are many things that happen to people's brains that make us really question, is that actually them? So when we know that people have certain types of cognitive impairments, we give them medication like, say, Zoloft. That really does affect your thoughts. And so I wanted to ask you guys, since medications like Zoloft physically cause changes to your thought patterns, does that change how you view your personal identity? So are you really still you when you're on medication that changes your behavior?
I would say that even though medication can change you pretty fundamentally with your personality traits, and they can change you physically and obviously change the chemical compositions in your brain and everything like that, I wouldn't say that changes your personal identity or what makes you you. And I think that because I think part of our personal identity is change anyway. I think that naturally occurs. And obviously there's tons of science out there showing that we become new people all the time. Our cells are changing, the chemical compositions in us are changing. I think personal identity in general is fluid and is always changing anyway. So even though medications are an external source of that, and maybe they put you on a path that you wouldn't have naturally gone onto, or maybe they just speed up the path that you would have gotten onto anyway naturally, I don't think that changes who you are as a person. I think that's the same thing as saying, well, when I was 9 years old, I wasn't me, just because we act so differently than we did when we were 9 years old. Well, that's not true. You were still you when you were 9 years old, obviously, but you just acted differently because of the circumstances around you. That doesn't mean you were a different person. So again, even though the medications might change you a little bit, I think that's just part of the human condition, and I wouldn't say that affects your personal identity per se.
I think a little bit of your personality is going to come through because it changes the way that endorphins are released. So I think that if you are careful with the way you take them and if you're like sticking to them, yourself is going to come through it, but it's going to be a different version of yourself. So I think that your thoughts and actions are still going to have a little bit of you, but what you let out is going to be different, and it may actually change the way that you're thinking. So your thought process may change a little bit, your mood may change, but I think that the core core things behind you, like what you believe and how you view the world, is pretty much going to stay the same. It's just going to be more positive or more negative depending on what medication you're taking. So I think your personal identity stays the same. It just changes a little bit towards whatever direction the medications are, but who you really are should still be there, even if there are some slight changes.
Well, I think that everything causes changes to the way that we think, the food we eat, the quality of air we breathe, how much sleep we've had the night before, non-physical things like stress. I think that medicine like Zoloft are no different. Of course, it changes how your brain handles the information it's presented with. But more interesting, at least to me, that part of that question was how we define ourselves in the first place. Our bodies are constantly undergoing change and recycling old cellular tissue for new tissue. In fact, it reminds me of something called the grandfather's boat paradox. I think that that's a good analogy for our bodies. Like after a long enough period of time, pretty much all the cells in your bodies have been replaced by new ones. And so at what point are you no longer you in that chain? And I think that's why, for me at least, it's important to look at yourself as kind of a dynamic thing. Anytime you refer to yourself, it's sort of a snapshot. You're just taking a picture of something that's that way at that time. The next second goes down the road and it's completely different. In fact, I can't remember where I heard it, but it was like 200 million of your cells every 2 minutes die and get replaced with other cells. It's insane to think how quickly your body changes.
So identity's fun to think about, but let's talk about real-life implications of free will and mental illness. So our justice system really only works with the belief in free will. The Supreme Court calls free will, quote, a universal and persistent foundation for our system of law, distinct from the deterministic view of human conduct that is inconsistent with the underlying precepts of our criminal justice system. And that was in the United States versus Grace in 1978. So what does it really mean to be morally responsible? Because if on a normal day you find yourself unable to think things other than, let's say, thoughts of pedophilia or murder, are you really responsible for those thoughts? Because they really reflect nothing of your, quote, usual personality. So what would you do if you suddenly started having these thoughts? This actually happened. So this is taken from the New Scientist online website, and it's written by Charles Choi, and it's called Brain Tumors Cause Uncontrollable Paedophilia. So the sudden and uncontrollable pedophilia exhibited by a 40-year-old man was caused by an egg-sized brain tumor, his doctors have told a scientific conference. And once the tumor had been removed, his sex obsession disappeared. The cancer was located in the right lobe of the orbitofrontal cortex, which is known to be tied to judgment, impulse control, and social behavior. But neurologists Russell Swerdlow and Jeffrey Burns of the University of Virginia at Charlottesville believe it is the first reported case linking damage to the region with pedophilia. Quote, we're dealing with the neurology of morality here, says Swerdlow. Since the area does not affect physical health, it's one of those areas where you could have a lot of damage and a doctor would never suspect that something's wrong, he says. So Burns said he wasn't faking. But if someone argues that every pedophile needs an MRI, the difference in this case was that the patient had had a normal history before he acquired the problem. Most pedophiles develop problems early on in life. The man, a schoolteacher, began secretly visiting child pornography websites and soliciting prostitutes at massage parlors, which are activities he had not engaged in previously. Swerdlow says while the man felt that his new behavior was unacceptable, in his words, the pleasure principle overrode his restraint. So when the man's wife found out that he had made subtle sexual advances towards young children, he was legally evicted from his house and found guilty of child molestation and medicated for pedophilia. Then the judge ruled that he had to pass a 12-step Sexaholics Anonymous rehabilitation program or face jail time. But the man was expelled after he failed to restrain himself from asking a woman at the program for sex. The evening before his prison sentencing, he took himself to the hospital complaining of headaches and saying he was afraid he would rape his landlady. So, if the tumor caused the thoughts, is he actually responsible for those thoughts? Because it turned out that after they removed the tumor, his thoughts were gone and he felt back to, quote, normal. But then months later, he started having headaches again, and then he started collecting the pornography, so back to the hospital he went. And they had discovered another tumor had came up in that exact same spot. So if tumors cause behavioral changes, how should that change how we view our legal system? Because Isn't that man kinda just a victim of bad luck? So in Sam Harris's book, he gives a list of interesting moral responsibility cases, and these will really pry at your intuitions of what it means to actually make choices and have the freedom to do so. So in each of these cases, a young woman dies due to the fault of another person. So number 1, a 4-year-old boy was playing with his father's gun and killed a young woman. The gun had been kept loaded and unsecured. Number 2, a 12-year-old boy who was the victim of continual emotional and physical abuse took his father's gun and intentionally killed a young woman because she was teasing him. Number 3, a 25-year-old man who had been the victim of continual abuse as a child intentionally shot his girlfriend because she left him for another man. Number 4, a 25-year-old man who was raised by loving parents intentionally shot and killed a young woman he had never met just for the fun of it. Number 5, a 25-year-old man who was raised by loving parents intentionally shot and killed a young woman he had never met just for the fun of it, but during an MRI scan found a tumor over the prefrontal cortex, a region responsible for the control of emotion and behavioral impulses. So again, in each case a woman is dead, but there's definitely degrees of outrage. Like in the first 2 cases, the brain really isn't fully matured. And then how much does abuse tie in? So I've given these cases to you guys, and let's check out your responses.
I think all the scenarios really come down to whether or not the person who committed the act had an understanding of what the act was. Certainly the 4-year-old in the first story was not at fault, but I would also argue that the father would be guilty of some negligence in that he didn't safely store the weapon. However, I don't think he directly was responsible for the death. Because I think that's an important distinction to make between actively doing the deed and having to do with the deed based on you not doing something. For the other 3 scenarios, it seems that in each of them, the person committing the act may have had limited capacity to understand the outcome of the act, and or due to some physical or emotional abuse, perception of what a moral or normal act is in the world may have been skewed. In each of those cases, I think that it's important to segregate them from the normal community, obviously to protect them and the people around them. But the sense of punishing in order to teach some sort of lesson or to correct some sort of action and to make them feel bad isn't necessarily what I would consider appropriate for that. I think that treatment should be given for any sort of disorders that they may have, physical or emotional. And I think that, again, they should be segregated, whether that's indefinite or just for a period of time, determining whether or not they're safe to return. I guess that's the case. But even in the scenario where someone was raised by a loving home and there was no outward signs of emotional issues, at least no outside influence on those emotional issues, or some physical thing like a tumor, it still could be the case that you mentioned in the story that they did it for fun. Sounds to me that also might be the case that that particular person wouldn't have the capacity to understand those decisions. So it's tough. I mean, I'm not an expert in any of these sort of topics, but I think the least of which would be law. I think that we have a responsibility as a society to protect the greater good, the people around us, but also to help and understand those that can't make decisions for themselves, regardless of the deeds they maybe have committed. I think that there's a safe and morally valid way of doing that.
With the case A, I don't think the boy should be in trouble. I think it should definitely be the person who left it loaded. When you're that young, you watch on TV, you see people pick up a gun and shoot it. You play with Nerf guns where the whole point is to shoot people with it and hit them with it. You watch BB guns and you see paintball guns, and the whole point is that you try to hit your target. I feel like if you're like a 4-year-old or like if you're like 8 or whatever, yeah, people can tell you not to do it, but you're still at a young age where you don't quite understand the difference. So I think that if you leave a gun loaded and unsecured with a 4-year-old boy around, I don't think it's the 4-year-old's fault. I think it's the person who left the gun loaded that should be charged. But I think I need to know more about what happened to decide who's actually to blame, but it's definitely whoever left the gun loaded, because that's just not right.
I think science is far enough along that we can see if a brain is capable of making a decision, and if it is, then the justice system should act accordingly. So obviously with the 4-year-old, the brain isn't fully developed at all there. They don't really understand the consequences of actions. They probably don't even really know what was happening in that case. By no means is that the 4-year-old's fault. They had no intent. They had no decision process. They were just playing with what they probably thought was a toy. The 12-year-old is a little trickier because obviously they understand right and wrong at that point, and obviously the brain is more developed, but a 12-year-old brain is by far not as much developed as an adult brain by any stretch of the imagination. They're probably going through puberty as well, so there's a lot of different factors going on with that. I still definitely think the 12-year-old should suffer consequences because obviously not every 12-year-old is going out there and shooting people, so there's something wrong there, but I don't think that they should necessarily be tried as an adult, though they should suffer consequences. The gentleman who's 25 and was abused obviously could have some psychological problems, but as long as the brain is fully capable of making a decision, I think that he should be convicted accordingly. Just because if every single person who was abused shot people, I think that'd be one thing, but that's not the case. So he still decided to make that decision, even though his circumstances were more difficult. I understand that, but he still made that decision. I would say the same thing for the gentleman who decided to kill somebody just for the fun of it. Obviously, there's some psychological problems there. I think the justice system needs to take care of that just because that person can't really be in our society. Their brain is making those type of decisions, then I definitely think they're at fault. And even if you want to argue that maybe, there's chemicals in his brain and he can't help it, I mean, the justice system still needs to get somebody like that out of our society. And then as far as the last person who shows that there was a tumor on the brain and shows that the brain was affected, I think that in that case, then we should see what we can do to help. And then I don't think we necessarily have to take them completely out of society. I think we have, as far as putting them in prison, we definitely need to get the medical treatment and go from there. If otherwise they're a normal human, I don't think it'd be any issue to just see if we can cure them and then go forward. It's a lot different than the gentleman before him who had a fully functioning brain and then made that decision. I think if there's something that's affecting your brain specifically, like a tumor, then I wouldn't necessarily that you would be 100% at fault.
So I really think intentions matter. And this is because intentions reflect our overall minds. Intentions will tell us what someone will do in the future. But how much is luck really attributed to a lot of those cases that we were talking about earlier? So in a way, aren't psychopaths just incredibly unlucky? Because even if you believe we have souls, the soul of a psychopath still has to be incredibly unlucky to receive that soul. So should we still hate them? I mean, we should fear them, but does hating them really make sense? I also want to say that I would never downplay the importance of the victim, because I completely understand that someone could not just say, oh, well, his brain made him do it, so I guess it's okay that he raped my wife or killed my husband. No, absolutely not. That's ridiculous, and I would never expect anyone to just get over it like that. But the point is, we're talking about our justice system, and I think that if our justice system relies too much on individual emotional cases, we really wouldn't be able to get much done. So our system of justice should really understand that many of us are dealt different hands of life, because through a combination of bad genes, bad parents, bad environments, and bad ideas, I mean, a lot of those are reasons for criminals and just the overall downtroddens of society. So I want you to think about, if we actually had a cure for evil, would we still want that retributive justice? So like I said earlier, if someone raped your wife or killed your husband, I mean, you couldn't really just accept that it was just a tumor. But if we had a cure for evil, we would definitely want to use it. But would it do anything for the victims? That is something I can't exactly answer. Now, in the said future when we have a cure, what if someone commits a crime, but it could have been prevented had they been given the cure? Should they still be blamed? So it's really time to think about how much biology actually plays a role in our decision making, and we have to start thinking about how that should affect our justice system. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to further this discussion, please go to www.themoraltrigger.com and comment on our blog. You can also become a monthly subscriber to our newsletter. You can give a one-time donation through PayPal. And lastly, you can become a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/themoraltrigger. Through your support, we're able to keep the discussion going and make sure that none of us are silent.